Most people don't pay attention to Africa until something goes wrong. A conflict breaks out and suddenly everyone wants context. But the signs, they were always there, just not where the headlines were looking. Welcome to The Diplomat, inside the room where power speaks. I'm Khawli, and in this episode, I sit down with Ambassador David Shin. He was the US ambassador to Ethiopia in the late 90s, back when Washington thought the region was stable. And that was right before the war between Ethiopia and Eritrea caught everyone off guard. He saw how American ideals of democracy ran into realities of survival. And he's one of the few people who has always said this out loud. You cannot understand the Horn of Africa if you treat each crisis like it's happening in a vacuum. It's all connected. In this episode, we talk about the signs that were missed before the war broke out between Ethiopia and Eritrea, the myth of neutrality in regional conflicts like the Sudan's civil war, and the word genocide, why diplomats fear saying it, and what happens when they wait too long to say it, why pushing Western-style democracy in the Global South often backfires. Africa makes up 20% of the world population, which means 1 out of 5 people on Earth reside in Africa. Yet, as a global community, we choose to cover less than 5% of its narrative. This isn't just skewed reporting. It is a collective failure to see, to understand, and to engage with a continent that is fundamentally shaping our shared future. This is not a coincidence, it's a blind spot, and blind spots in foreign policy have consequences. This is The Diplomat, inside the room where power speaks, and this is a conversation you won't hear anywhere else. Mr. Ambassador, welcome to The Diplomat. Before the headlines and before the wars, when you were ambassador, when the war between Ethiopia and Eritrea began, that war started out of nowhere, at least to the world. For you, did you see the cracks forming before it happened?
We were surprised also, quite frankly. We saw some cracks, but we did not think they were significant enough to lead to an outright conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea. We were trying to put together the pieces in order to understand, obviously, what was going on between the two countries, but it just didn't seem that it had come to the point of an all-out war. And from my understanding, the government of Ethiopia was equally surprised by the initial attack from the Eritrean forces. They did not have any significant armed force near the border. If they had thought there was going to be a war, I think they would have had forces down there, but they didn't. So I'm pretty much convinced that they were taken by surprise also. You're quite right. Our job is to try to predict these kinds of things and to take steps to prevent them. But in this case, we simply didn't do it, but no one else did either. No one was talking about a possible war between Ethiopia and Eritrea at that point. On the other hand, we very quickly got involved, this was during the Clinton administration, in trying to bring it to a ceasefire or to bring it to a quick ending. And a great deal of effort went into that in the initial first weeks of the war, without success, but nevertheless the effort was made.
Walk us through that time, 1998. What were the signals that were missed by diplomats? Because you just mentioned that not just you as Americans and as diplomats in the country back then, but even other diplomats in the world, they didn't see that. Can you walk us through this?
The small cracks that we did see were some economic issues, some diminished economic activity between Ethiopia and Eritrea, which you can account for in many ways, but it was apparent after the fact, after the war broke out, that they contributed to this breakdown in the relationship between the two countries. There was a more significant one that perhaps we should have picked up on and didn't, and it was an incursion by the Ethiopians They say chasing Afar rebels. Afar is another ethnic group that crosses the border between Ethiopia and Eritrea. But Afar rebels that had moved into Eritrea, the Ethiopians pursued them, and the Ethiopians argue that they were only there a brief period of time. The Eritreans say, no, they were there a much longer period of time. And we clearly didn't know what was going on with that episode. But with the benefit of hindsight, the Eritreans used that as part of the reason for the attack on Ethiopia, that there were, in fact, Ethiopian troops that had penetrated into Eritrea to chase down these Afar rebels. The details of that have never been totally clear, in my view, as to how long the Ethiopians were inside Eritrea or how many there were. But this really didn't become an issue with us until after the war had broken out.
If you put yourself today differently than 1998, would we get it right the same way or slightly different since we're pulling out of Africa today?
Well, Washington and the embassy were on the same page as far as what was going on in 1998. There was no problem there. The problem is that all of us, without exception, including the Ethiopian government, simply were not fully aware of what was happening on the other side of the border, and nor was our embassy in Eritrea, for that matter. Today, if we had a similar kind of issue, particularly after all of these cuts take effect, then I think we would be in an even more difficult position than we were back in 1998. So far, the cuts have not had a dramatic impact yet on foreign policy in Africa, but it's pretty apparent that they're going to have a huge impact. For example, USAID is shut down for all practical purposes in Ethiopia. We had USAID people operating not too far from the border area back in 1998. And even though they didn't know what was likely, that the war was going to break out, they were very helpful to us in the days immediately after the war broke out.
You've said before, Africans aren't looking for lists; they're looking for respect and real partnership. What did you mean by that, and where was the U.S. falling short?
In terms of the war in 1998, well, I think that the Africans are looking primarily for respect and partnership. They want to be consulted. They don't want to be told what to do by donor countries or Western countries or any other country for that matter.
Yeah, specifically if we talk about the interactions with Meles Zenawi.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, yes, and I'm referring to those interactions. Meles Zenawi and Ethiopians generally are very proud people. Most people are proud people, but I would say that the Ethiopians are particularly proud people, perhaps because of their long independent history. And Meles Zenawi clearly did not like the idea of being told what to do or how to do it. So he was more interested in having a partnership with the United States on what he perceived to be an equal basis than being told what to do or facing political conditionality. And sometimes we're pretty good at imposing political conditionality or economic conditionality on other countries, or at least we try to. That doesn't work very well, quite frankly, anywhere, but it certainly doesn't work well in Ethiopia.
What does that mean in terms of U.S. expectations and African realities?
Well, in terms of U.S. expectations, it means that we put conditions on a lot of our foreign assistance. And some of those conditions, even though the Ethiopian government accepted them, were not very palatable. And they sort of swallowed hard in order to at least obtain the funding that the United States was willing to offer. But they did so, and it created, in a way that created a certain amount of animosity between the United States and Ethiopia. So one has to be very careful in terms of conditionality. Sometimes we were not as careful as we perhaps should have been.
Being careful and talking about priorities, which leads me to asking you, how do you talk about democracy or development as talking points in terms of United States or Washington toward other countries or African countries when your counterpart is dealing with literal survival?
It's hard. And it's easier to talk about democracy if there is an understanding that you are using the same definition of democracy. And that's often a problem. The U.S. definition of Western-style democracy is not necessarily what countries in the global South understand it to be, and certainly not countries like, say, China or Russia understand it to be. So we often have a misunderstanding from the very beginning as to what we're really referring to. We know from our side what we're referring to, free and fair elections, due process, rule of law, freedom of the press, all of this stuff.
But is all that still happening today, or the world is watching and saying that this is not the same?
It's not happening in many places, and it's not happening consistently in Ethiopia today, nor was it happening then. And that's where you have a disconnect. So that we're sometimes sort of talking along parallel tracks. We think we're talking about the same thing, but in fact, we're talking about rather different things. You can get into trouble very quickly that way. We were never very successful during my time in Ethiopia in convincing the Ethiopians of pursuing Western-style democracy in the country. They wanted to pursue it in their way, and I understand that. I mean, it is their country after all. But we're fooling ourselves sometimes when we try to impose a system that just isn't going to be accepted by the government.
What are we doing now? Or what do you suggest that the language, instead of like imposing democracy or imposing development, and instead of understanding, how do we understand more other countries' specificities?
Well, one, you use the term our understanding of what's going on in Ethiopia or in a foreign country. That's a starting point. You must have a thorough understanding as to where they're coming from. And if you don't have that understanding, you're never going to have much success in encouraging the people in that country to accept your goals and ideals. And they're probably never going to accept them to the full extent because they don't totally agree with them. But there are elements that they might accept. If you can encourage a somewhat freer press, for example, maybe not totally free. I mean, after all, the United States was number 57 in the Press Freedom Index in 2025. 10 African countries were higher than the United States this past year. So, we've got some things that we could improve in our own system. But in the case of Ethiopia, it's very low. It's far below the United States, for example. But if you can just get it into a somewhat better position so that they don't jail journalists, for example, which they do with some regularity, then you're having some success. But unfortunately, that continues to happen in so many countries in the global South where journalists are jailed. Now, fortunately, we've not reached that point in the United States, but there are a lot of countries where that does happen. And you just have to chip away at it piece by piece and issue by issue. Due process, if you can make a little progress on due process in these countries, you're making headway. It's probably never going to be quite the same as what we have in the United States. But as we see in the United States, there's change going on, and it's not always necessarily in the right direction.
Change, I mean, it seems that's one thing humanity cannot run away from, is constant change, whether it's in politics or geography and everything. And even while you were based in Ethiopia, you were tracking Sudan's civil war. Was it possible to talk to one country without talking about the other?
Not entirely. In other words, I had no direct responsibility for Sudan. When I was ambassador in Ethiopia, your focus has to be obviously on Ethiopia-U.S. relations. But that doesn't mean there were no conversations about Sudan. There were frequent conversations. And I also had a very good relationship with the Sudanese ambassador in Addis Ababa, and we consulted regularly whenever senior officials from Sudan came to Addis Ababa, which they did regularly. he would normally put me in contact with them. Since our ambassador had been pulled out of Khartoum at that point, located in Nairobi, Kenya, it was an opportunity for me to interact with senior Sudanese officials that even our ambassador had some difficulty interacting with because he could only visit occasionally from Nairobi. So yes, there were a lot of conversations with the Ethiopians about Sudan. Generally, I would say our positions were quite similar on Sudan. We both wanted stability in the country. We both wanted any conflict to come to an end. This was a period when you had north-south problems. You still had a unified Sudan. You did not have an independent southern Sudan at that point. And I think Ethiopia and the United States' position were quite similar.
While Ethiopia is going through its own difficulties, political hardships, how did Ethiopia help shaping peace talks?
We don't necessarily know what they were doing behind the scenes. They might have had a more active engagement than we were aware of. Certainly, Ethiopia at that time was encouraging peace in Sudan because it was in the interest of Ethiopia to have peace and stability in Sudan. Ethiopia also had a history of taking sides, however, in the conflict in Sudan. At one point, they were giving very strong support to the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, the southern movement that ultimately became independent. So there was a history of that in Khartoum. The government there was aware of that. They were probably suspicious that maybe the Ethiopians were not always being honest in terms of their approach. But by the time you get to 1998, or the period that I was in Sudan, the government in Ethiopia was fairly closely aligned with what was going on with the government in Khartoum. They had frequent interaction. They seemed to support each other, and clearly they were both engaged in trying to bring the war to an end. So the Ethiopians may have played an even stronger role than we were aware of, but on the surface they were doing positive kinds of things.
So Ethiopia was playing some significant role. What were the blind spots of the United States? What we were oversimplifying what exactly?
Well, the United States was interested in at that time in bringing the conflict to a halt between Northerners and Southerners. We had not yet reached the point where we were pressing for independence of South Sudan. That came later. And ultimately, the U.S. was very strong in supporting an independent South Sudan. But during the time that I was serving in Ethiopia up until 1999, that was not the purpose of the United States or the goal of the United States. It was to just bring the conflict to an end and ideally maintain a unified but far more democratic, unified Sudan. That, of course, didn't happen, but that was the goal of the United States.
Is it why you said the Horn isn't a region of isolated crisis? It's one nervous system.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And has been ever since the end of World War II.
Do we understand this today? Did we understand it back then? Or that was you signaling a very specific messaging to Washington, D.C.?
It was understood that all of that was part of the same puzzle. And that was one of the reasons for having this Greater Horn of Africa initiative that came out of a combination of USAID and the State Department during the earlier part of the Clinton administration, when I was director of East African Affairs in Washington, to try to deal with all of these interlinked conflicts by being more supportive on the development and the aid side. That initiative lasted for 5 or 6 years, ultimately was abandoned because conflict overwhelmed it in part. There were other reasons why it also failed. It did have a useful impact upon dealing with humanitarian issues, but not in terms of ending conflict.
Do you think Washington, D.C. gets this nervous system today? The importance of taking care of that nervous system instead of pulling out?
That's a very interesting question. Obviously, I'm not in government today, so I don't know the intricacies of who was doing what to whom in either the State Department, the White House, or anywhere else. But I think I can say, without any reservations or qualms, that if you start reducing significantly your presence in the region, your programs in the region, which we seem to be doing, you are going to have a much less good understanding as to what's going on in that area. It's just a fact of life. You have to have people on the ground to know what's going on. You cannot do it from neighboring regions or countries or from Washington. Doesn't work that way, or occasional visits out there. That's all fantasy.
Given that circumstance and what you're trying to say right now, you were also pushing for Washington back then to understand the Horn of Africa as a geostrategic zone, way before it became, a post 9/11 talking point. Did you feel alone in that narrative back then?
No, not alone, not at all. There were others in the region that I think felt the same way, and other embassies in neighboring countries. There were people in Washington who clearly understood that, because you do have people moving back and forth from the region to Washington, as I have done in my career, and vice versa. So I never felt that I was alone in that. And I felt that the Africa Bureau and the State Department had a pretty good understanding.
So you were not ignored, you were heard.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
The Keystone State metaphor about Ethiopia, what was that? Can you fill us in?
Well, Ethiopia is the second most populous country in all of Africa. And it's bordered by all of the countries in the Horn, literally. And it's the only one that's bordered by all of them. All of the others have partial borders, but they don't have a border with everyone else. So in that sense, it's Keystone. You remove Ethiopia from the equation, and everything kind of collapses into the center, which is Ethiopia. So the combination of its huge population, so you have a situation where the entire Horn of Africa sort of collapses into the center, which is Ethiopia, which is also the second most populous country on the continent. So it's the combination of simply population and geography make it a keystone country.
But what does that mean today for Ethiopia's current situation?
That has not changed. What has changed is Ethiopia has had so many internal problems that it has diminished some of its strength and importance. If you have so many internal conflicts or ethnic conflicts, loss of economic power, they're going to have a lower voice in the Horn of Africa. And I think to some extent that has happened. Now, Ethiopia is also the location of the headquarters of the African Union, the Economic Commission for Africa. So it is a very important center of African political views because of particularly those two institutions. That has not changed either. But I think that Ethiopia has lost something over the years because of all of these internal conflicts.
In all the years you've served in Africa, across embassies, conflicts, and peace talks, what's one word that meant more than it seemed?
Genocide. And genocide for a lot of reasons. I would start with the genocide in Rwanda, which I was not directly involved in, but I was in the Africa Bureau at the time that it was happening, so I had access to what was going on. Genocide in Rwanda began on April 6, 1994, when the personal aircraft of the presidents of Rwanda and Burundi was shot down as it was entering Kigali Airport. The genocide effectively started the next day. There was a period of several days where it was very messy. No one quite knew what was happening in Rwanda. But it didn't take very long, maybe a week or so, before it was pretty obvious to the world that genocide was underway in Rwanda. But was anyone declaring genocide? No. Why were they not declaring genocide? Because that implied you had to take action to stop it. So the United States, on May 21 of 1994, declared acts of genocide. Now, what's the difference between acts of genocide and genocide? I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. But the lawyers seem to think there was a big difference. And if you declare an act of genocide, you're not declaring genocide. It's something else. The U.S. did not declare genocide until June 10 of 1994, more than 2 months after it had broken out. And finally, Secretary of State Warren Christopher said, okay, fine, it's genocide. We're now on the record. And at that point, the United States did get very active in trying to deal with the humanitarian problem. 1 million refugees in Tanzania, 1 million refugees in the Eastern Congo. And we made a huge effort to try to alleviate their problems. But we didn't ever really get involved in stopping the genocide. And you can look at that as it has gone through time. Darfur, early this century, it took quite a while for us to declare genocide in Sudan. We ultimately did, but it was mainly as a result of congressional pressure that we did. Now, you bring it up all the way to the present, and the United States was declaring in Sudan, in Darfur particularly, war crimes and crimes against humanity in 2020 through the end of 2023, but not genocide. And it was only at the very end of the Biden administration, a few days before the inauguration of President Trump, that the administration declared there is genocide in Darfur. There's this great reluctance to use the term genocide for fear that it will require you to do something about it. And you have the same issues going on in places like Gaza, where people just don't want to use the word genocide, and it's with a great reluctance. And it is a very meaningful word.
And what's one phrase you wish diplomats today would retire when talking about Africa?
Well, I wish they'd retire it in discussion of almost anything, and that's I'm cautiously optimistic that about this particular conflict or dispute. Cautiously optimistic means different things to different people, but to me it means one thing. It means I'm hopeful that this will come to a good end, but I don't have any idea whatsoever what's going to happen with it. Now, that's not going to be the definition that most people will give you, but let's just get rid of cautiously optimistic. It's a meaningless term.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Diplomat. If this conversation gave you a pause, good. That means it did its job. You can follow the show on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And if this episode made you see diplomacy differently, share it, especially with someone who still thinks Africa is a side story or an afterthought. Pause and reflect on this imbalance. Africa, a continent pulsing with 20% of humanity, consistently registers below 5% in global news attention. What does it say about our collective priorities and our shared future when so many voices remain unheard? Every week, I sit down with the people who have had the chance to make impossible choices. The ones who were not just sent to deliver a message, but to read the room when history was about to turn. Because language isn't just how we explain foreign policy, it's how we shape it. This is The Diplomat, inside the room where power speaks.